So it's just so interesting, this whole thing about dieting. It is kind of an aggressive act, meaning it's taking your body in one state and forcing it to eat in a way that is opposite to its biochemical reality. And let me kind of unload what I mean by that. So instead of dieting, the way to approach your body when you want to improve health is to change its biochemistry. And then as its biochemistry changes, your cravings actually naturally change. Your gut flora or the gut microbiome actually has a huge influence on the foods that you crave and the foods that you're eating. And trying to fight it is, it's actually an impossible task. And that's what we're learning even from studies that we're doing now.
Namaste. You're listening to the Savannah Podcast. Join us on an exploration of Eastern spirituality, yoga philosophy, and conscious living for the new age. This podcast is a production of SavannahSpirit.com, where you can find a large selection of Om and yoga clothing, spiritual jewelry, and unique fair trade gifts from the Far East. Now here's your host, Ashton Szabo.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Savannah Podcast. I am your host, Ashton Szabo. Today's show is all about how to optimize your health, increase your brain power, and naturally shed excess pounds. Here to talk with us today is Dr. Kulreet Chaudhary. She's an integrative neurologist and the author of a book called The Prime, Prepare and Repair Your Body for Spontaneous Weight Loss. Dr. Kulreet, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Ashton. I'm so excited to be here with you.
Well, we're excited to have you. Before we actually jump in, what is an integrative neurologist?
It's a great question because there's not a whole lot of us. But essentially, it's a neurologist, so an MD, that doesn't look at the brain as an isolated organ, but is really looking at how the health of the entire body is impacting brain function. And the path that I used was the ancient science of Ayurveda, but you could be using traditional Chinese medicine or functional medicine. But it's really looking at the brain as a partner in the body and not as an isolated entity.
And how did you originally get involved with medicine, in particular Ayurvedic medicine?
Well, Ayurvedic medicine has always been kind of part of my upbringing, although we wouldn't have called it medicine at the time. It was just the way we lived, the way we cooked. When my sister and I got, respiratory infections or a cold, my parents reached for the turmeric and honey before they reached for antibiotics. But it wasn't until I was actually a practicing neurologist and developed migraine headaches that I really came back into Ayurvedic medicine, because everything I was using, the traditional prescriptions, weren't working or were causing such severe side effects that I couldn't tolerate it. So it was at that time that I actually went back to my mom and asked for help with the migraine headaches, and she reintroduced me into Ayurvedic medicine. And as soon as I started using it, my headaches were gone within 3 months. But it didn't stop there. My entire well-being really kind of resurfaced. And that was when I knew I had to incorporate this into the way I was practicing neurology.
Now, I think a lot of people, our listeners, will have a basic understanding of Ayurveda. Perhaps we could just really quickly give an overall view of what Ayurvedic medicine is.
Sure. Ayurvedic medicine, you could look at it as kind of the original lifestyle medicine on the planet. We talk so much nowadays about personalized medicine and epigenetics, the way that the environment and what you're eating is actually affecting gene expression. And as far as we know, Ayurvedic medicine was the original science of how the environment and your habits and stress and so forth actually affect your health. And the fundamental principles really is that food is medicine, and that disease results from an imbalance. Disease is not some natural state that happens because we age, but it is an aberration from our natural state, and it occurs from very specific influences. And those influences are further divided into, the three doshas, Vata, Pitta, and Kapha. And these are basically the original, you could say, archetypes of our mind-body patterns. I usually describe Ayurvedic medicine as kind of the way that nature intended to interact with us. And it's very, very individualized. And it's a combination of, your genetic predisposition and how that genetic predisposition interacts with your environment.
You mentioned food, and obviously there's a big emphasis on food when it comes to your overall health in Ayurveda. So a lot of people hear that, and the natural mental response is, okay, well, that means dieting. And in your book, you write about dieting, and you say that we're doing it backwards. So why is it backwards?
So it's so interesting, this whole thing about dieting. It is kind of an aggressive act, meaning it's taking your body in one state and forcing it to eat in a way that is opposite to its biochemical reality. And let me kind of unload what I mean by that. So instead of dieting, the way to approach your body when you want to improve health is to change its biochemistry. And then as its biochemistry changes, your cravings actually naturally change. And so in the book, in the Prime, what I outline is I first of all explain this connection, how your gut flora or the gut microbiome actually has a huge influence on the foods that you crave and the foods that you're eating. And trying to fight it is, it's actually an impossible task. And that's what we're learning even from studies that we're doing now, is that it is such a strong influence that you can't resist it. You can simply change the type of bacteria that live in your gut. So that's one of the things that's involved in this program, is changing your microbiome naturally. And the second major aspect is changing what I call neuroadaptation, which is basically the food addictions that arise from the foods you eat, but changing that naturally. And then the third thing is detoxification. So removing the junk that is clogging your system that makes dietary changes so difficult. So the reason, we call this book The Prime is this program is the pre-step to any dietary changes. And again, I'm not using the word diet because these are spontaneous changes. Your cravings begin to drop. Your cravings for healthy foods begin to emerge. So this just simply becomes the way that you're eating. It's not something that you're doing for a short period. It's the natural cravings that your body has to sustain itself in a healthy state.
Well, I think that's part of the overall problem with dieting, is that it kind of implies this inherent idea that it's just a short-term thing. Like, you're going to change what you do for a little bit, hope to see results, and then you're going to go back to the previous lifestyle that was causing whatever the conditions, whether it was dis-ease, issues with the health, or excess weight, which creates the problem. And I love the approach that it's more of a supportive role rather than like just a negation role, that kind of you'll want to shed some of these things that you don't feel good on naturally, but right now you can't even tell that they don't make you feel good because you're just chemically addicted.
Exactly.
To a lot of
the analogy I use quite a bit, Ashton, with my patients and with audiences I speak to, is if you drop a little bit of ink into a murky glass of water, into a muddy glass of water, you'll never even notice that drop of ink. But if you take a clean glass and put that same drop of ink in, it's apparent. And so what we're doing in the Prime is essentially removing the mud, removing the junk from your system, so that when you do add something into your body, like a drop of ink, and let's say in the form of processed food, that your body actually notices it and says, hey, we don't want this. If you're doing a diet and at the end of the diet, you still have your old cravings, you didn't go through a biochemical shift. In other words, you didn't actually change the structure of your body. You just kind of enforced a set of rules for a short period for a temporary outcome, but your body's biochemistry is essentially untouched.
Mm-hmm. In my 20s, I experimented a lot with cleansing and fasting, and one of the things that kind of always fascinated me at the end of a effective cleanse or fast, I would have like the most simple, basic greens ever, which normally be like, oh, gross, this is so bitter and so nasty, and that like my first meal back would be a small plate of that, and be like, oh my gosh, this is the most amazingly flavorful thing I've ever eaten in my entire life. But if I were to even eat that now, where my diet has gotten definitely more back into dairy recently and more back into sweets, I have a young daughter, and so, working around her palate and then what we can eat as well. And it's, if I'd eat something like that today, it'd probably be a very similar experience. Like, oh, like I'm going to have to suffer through this a little bit, instead of like, oh my gosh, this has so much flavor and it's so amazing.
And that is actually, Ashton, your gut flora, so the bacteria and yeast in your gut communicating with your brain. And it's so interesting to me when people say, I crave this. And I always go back to that sentence and I say, who do you think the I is in that sentence? Because it's rarely you. It really has more to do with who's living in your gut. And so if you just look at it as, well, my current gut flora craves this, then it kind of changes the perspective on it, because that can change instantaneously.
Well, and you said something in your book too. You said being overweight is a biochemical issue, not a personality flaw. And I love that, because I think a lot of people, kind of get caught up in this very toxic cycle of dieting, and they think there's something wrong with them, like mentally, personality-wise, instead of recognize you're actually fighting biochemistry, and with just a little bit of help and a little bit of knowledge, they can really shift these issues, because then they're not actually fighting against their own chemistry.
Exactly. And it's not like we go around and shame people for having high blood pressure. We shame people for having, hypothyroidism. We recognize those things as, oh yeah, those are biochemical or physical phenomenon. And there's really nothing more of a physical phenomenon than being overweight. And, we have experimented on that essentially in our culture. We altered the biochemistry of our food. We added things that were new to nature, artificial flavors, artificial colors, so forth. And what did we get? We got an obese society. So we're like this giant laboratory here in the US, and it's only proving my point. You change the biochemistry of what's going in, you will change the biochemistry in the body, and it will become obese. It's a simple little equation.
You touched on this very briefly a little bit earlier, and we were kind of talking about the overall health. You mentioned neuroadaptation. What is the role of digestion in all of this, and how does that play? Because talking about the gut flora and what's actually being absorbed in the body, like how important is that, and how do we start to approach that if we're wanting to make some changes?
Sure. So in Ayurvedic medicine, digestion is the heart of health. And until you improve digestion, you can't improve any other condition. And this was really kind of a spectacular realization for me as a neurologist, to think that brain health also laid in the gut. And now I don't even consider these two systems, as separate. They're really extensions of the same complex neurochemical network. And so if digestion is the key to health, and if you are basically missing the proper, and an extension of that, by the way, when I say digestion, it's also the bacteria that live in your GI tract. They are the key players in terms of digestive health. And so if you are, suffering from a digestive system that has tremendous inflammation, has the wrong bacteria, has what we call now, a leaky gut, you will notice systemic effects of that. Even if people don't have specific GI conditions, the systemic inflammation is a reflection of that faulty gut. And so all health begins, first by realigning the digestive system. And in terms of taking steps, this is where people often go wrong. The steps that they will take are often, I'm going to go on these extreme cleanses or these extreme diets. And that's just not the way that the GI tract heals. It heals slowly, step by step. But even just the first stage of the prime, where we're introducing, a very simple tea just made out of cumin, coriander, and fennel tea. It's so easy to make. It's so inexpensive, and yet it starts to heal that gut lining, and it starts to shift the type of microbes that you have in your GI tract. Another really simple addition in the first stage is adding an herb called triphala. Triphala is just simply 3 berries, but it does the same thing. It begins to heal the GI tract. And now as that healing occurs, then what you'll start to notice is that your tastes are beginning to change. And that's the approach that I really recommend. Always look at the gut health first and start with just simply helping it to heal. And as it heals, and as in the book I describe, as you go from a dumb gut to a smart gut, then the changes in terms of what you're eating become very spontaneous. And you mentioned this process of neuroadaptation. So neuroadaptation is just a way that the brain adapts to change. And when you're eating predominantly, sugary foods or foods that basically are feeding the unhealthy bacteria, the unhealthy flora in the gut, what happens is the brain actually becomes addicted to those foods. So you have to eat them just to feel normal, just like you would for cocaine. And in reality, when we look at the brains of individuals who are addicted to cocaine, they look exactly the same as obese individuals who are addicted to sugar. So in effect, sugar and other foods function as a drug on the brain. And that's really the whole concept behind neuroadaptation, is your brain can actually negatively adapt to food in the same way that it would adapt to a drug.
Now, in your book, you lay out a number of stages for people to go through, and to slowly and progressively, or some of the, you also have different speeds with which people can go, but it's all progressive through these stages. But for people listening today, how do they start to get back on track? I mean, you've mentioned this tea. I recommend people checking out your book. It's something that my wife and I are actually going to start on the programs in your book. But for people that are listening, how do they begin this journey to get on track? You mentioned kind of all starts with the gut. So is that really the place that they can go, and what are some really easy things along that line, just to kind of, hey, I'm addicted to sugar right now, I'm this, I'm that. How do I start to turn things around and go in the other direction?
So just as I mentioned, I would first just start with that tea. That tea is amazing. And I have had people give the recipe for that tea to like all of their family members during Christmas. And I have named that tea so many different things because it works for so many different conditions. So we've called it the fat loss tea, the digestive tea, the youthful skin tea, because as you start to improve your gut health, it starts to affect everything. And the recipe is so simple. It's just half a teaspoon of cumin seeds, coriander seeds, and fennel seeds. And I give some additional recommendations in the book for people who may need some other ingredients. But you can just simply start with those 3 ingredients, boil about 4 to 5 cups of water, add the seeds in, let the whole thing boil or steep, depending on how strong you want it. If you want a less strong tea, you let it steep. If you want a stronger tea, you let it boil for about 10 minutes. And then remove the seeds and just put it into a thermos and sip it all day long. And the other big thing I would recommend is triphala. And the one that I have used for my patients, the brand is called Digestion from MAPI, simply because that seems to be one of the best absorbed and most effective triphala brands out there. But there's several different brands. And you just start with 1,000 milligrams at bedtime. Those 2 interventions are so simple, so inexpensive, and yet so powerful.
Quick question on both of those, and maybe the answer is different for each, but for women that might be pregnant or breastfeeding, are there any contraindications? I know one of the extra ingredients you have to the prime tea is fenugreek, and fenugreek is actually something that stimulates lactation, so I know that that's a desirable one for breastfeeding mamas, but are any of the other ingredients a concern if someone is pregnant or lactating?
It's a great question. So I actually do tea for women when they're pregnant because it helps with their digestion. And remember, all of these ingredients are foods, and they're actually even used, in Indian cooking on a daily basis. So these are spices that when Indian women are pregnant, they're consuming on an absolute daily basis. And when you're breastfeeding and drinking the tea, it actually helps to reduce colic in the baby because, again, it's a digestive aid. So there's no contraindication whatsoever with tea. I would actually highly recommend it when women are pregnant and breastfeeding. Now, in terms of the triphala is only It's 3 berries, and so it's also a food-grade substance. But typically what we recommend is, unless women need some additional help with the triphala, meaning like they're constipated during pregnancy, we usually won't give any herbs, even when, in this case, these 3 berries are very, very mild, especially compared to so many of the medications we give to pregnant women. But the general philosophy in Ayurvedic medicine is when a woman is pregnant, that you intervene little as possible. So it's not so much that it's a contraindication. For example, if a woman is having constipation, then we will add it. It's just that there's this general feeling of not to add anything, not to fix anything that's not broken during pregnancy, because it's considered such a sacred time, and allowing the natural intelligence of the baby to kind of govern the whole process.
Going back to kind of where we were, you've mentioned the brain-gut connection a couple of times. So I was wondering if you could kind of explain that a little further and tell us how that's really affecting our health.
Sure. So this was, as I said before, one of the biggest surprises for me as a neurologist, and also for me as a migraine patient, is as soon as I began to fix my gut, my migraine headaches went away immediately. And there's, a tremendous amount of overlap, which I mentioned in the book. But let me just kind of show you one simple connection. So the bacteria in your GI tract, when you start to have the wrong population of bacteria, the unhealthy, or what we call parasitic bacteria, actually have an endotoxin. So that's a toxic byproduct in their cell wall. And when they die off, and if there's gut permeability, which we find to be present in many people who have neurological conditions, what happens is those toxins escape from your gut into your bloodstream, and they are directly toxic to the brain. They actually break down the blood-brain barrier, which is this protective barrier that prevents inflammatory molecules from entering the brain. And these toxins actually will break that down and allow inflammation to enter the brain. In fact, pharmaceutical companies that create drugs for the use of Parkinson's disease actually use some of these endotoxins in animal models in order to create inflammation in the brain and create Parkinson's in animals. So that's just one example of how what happens in your gut can travel up to the brain and actually cause brain dysfunction.
And is some of this process of talking of the endotoxins and the body's own response to toxins in the bloodstream, is that where then the body's attempting to store those toxins into fat? And that's where we're kind of getting this excess weight, which then kind of goes full circle again of once you start to approach these things, the fat naturally starts to shed off because the body's not trying to hide those toxins in fat.
That's exactly right. That's one part of it, is that the way that the body will protect these other organs, because it's looking at these organs as, prime real estate. And so it'll hide it in the fat cells. And so in that sense, your fat is your friend, in that it's really trying to protect you. And that's also why it's important to detox very slowly, because why you have some of the those kind of uncomfortable detox symptoms is as the fat starts to break down, guess what? It starts to release these toxins into your bloodstream. So you need specific herbs that help to remove them efficiently out of the body. But what also happens in addition to that is some of these toxins are directly toxic to some of the endocrine organs. And so they start to cause pancreatic dysfunction, and that is the gland that produces insulin. And so when there's an insulin dysregulation, that also causes weight to increase. So there's all of these different ways that biochemically your body gets set up to add on that extra weight. And if you're not changing that biochemical equation first, it's just this uphill battle, and it feels impossible.
Mm-hmm. So what are, let's say, the 3 most important things someone could do right now to help impact their health in a positive way?
The 3 most important things are, number 1, honestly, just becoming aware that what you put in your mouth actually is changing the health of your entire body. And even though these are typically steps that I recommend, once you go through the program, But just starting to simply choose like more organic foods that have fewer, pesticides, because those pesticides go in and many of them act like antibiotics to your natural healthy gut microbes. So it's actually killing them off. The second thing is to replace as many of your drinks with either water or decaffeinated herbal teas. Because again, that massive sugar load, and many people think, oh, that's okay. I drink a sugar-free drink, and those are even more inflammatory. The studies are showing that those even cause more weight gain because of this biochemical disruption that they lead to. So just drinking more water and natural teas rather than sodas and juices. And the third thing, which I mentioned in the book, is really switching when you eat your largest meal. Eating your largest meal at lunch and your smallest meal at dinner, because dinner is the time when your body's getting ready for detoxification and digestion is the weakest. Now, although these are, three really, really helpful tips, I still don't recommend trying to do them before you go through the process of changing your biochemistry, simply because sometimes these feel like that's too far out of my reach. I can't do this. But when your body starts shifting from a biochemical standpoint, it will dictate these changes, and it won't be effortful.
And if people were to start the tea, for example, and they're doing this throughout their lives, and the triphala as well, will they start to see effects pretty quickly that will kind of inspire them to be like, okay, I'm noticing a difference, so now I really want to get on track? Or is it a little bit longer before they start noticing those effects?
No, these two things are fairly powerful, and in part depends on how many toxins you have. And what's interesting is the more toxins you have, actually the faster you'll notice the effect, because you'll start to detoxify. And so it's typically within 2 weeks that most people who have extra toxins will start to notice symptoms. And sometimes the symptoms, though, are things like, hey, I'm getting headaches or I'm getting body aches. And those are all signs that your body's starting to process and move these toxins out and trying to get rid of them. But within 2 weeks, you'll start noticing change. And for other people, let's say they have kind of more mild to moderate toxicity in their body, and the gut IQ test in the book kind of gives you a sense of where you fall. Some of those people, as soon as they start, they just notice like, hey, I've noticed I have more energy, I have more clarity. But typically within 2 weeks, you'll notice something.
And something that you mentioned in your book, but we haven't talked about yet, but it's one that's kind of been in and out of my life over the years, is ashwagandha. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. I was really lucky. A student at the studio I'm teaching at up here in Grass Valley actually had some ashwagandha plants, and they gave me some of the berries to get the seeds from. So I'm going to...
Fantastic.
I get to start growing my own.
A beautiful gift. That's a really wonderful gift. So ashwagandha is just amazing. It's an adaptogen, which means it's one of the few herbs that we know of that helps the body adapt to stress. And ashwagandha is not traditionally used in Ayurvedic medicine for weight loss, but it's because traditionally weight gain was not the result of the types of reasons that we're seeing today. Now, today, stress plays such a huge role in weight gain, not just in terms of stress eating, but how it impacts your biochemistry, increasing cortisol levels, how it changes the microbiome in your gut, so the bacteria in your gut. And additionally, it has a huge impact on neuroadaptation. So, when I say stress eating, that's also affecting how your brain gets addicted to certain foods. And so ashwagandha is such a powerful herb that undermines all of those processes that are ultimately causing bad gut health or a dumb gut. And so it works on helping to reduce the biochemical effects of stress. It helps on resetting the microbiome. It really is just an amazing, amazing herb in terms of helping to reduce your sweet cravings in particular. And that's because of how it interrupts how stress impacts neuroadaptation. So again, not something that was traditionally used for weight loss in Ayurvedic medicine, but we're eating and we're gaining weight for completely different reasons today compared to 1,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Well, what's great too is that it seems like quite a holistic approach to this all, because we are looking at digestion and food and how that's all working with the body for our overall health. That starts to impact our cognitive function and how we're concentrating and focusing, because it's all interrelated. And as you said, it kind of leads to this natural shedding of excess pounds because we're not having all these extra toxins in the body. And we, of course, your book lays out a really clear plan for people, and we've talked about some things to get people to start. And I know some of this is actually part of the Constitution quiz as well, but I think a lot of people, and I'll speak for myself as well, like starting is super easy. But how do people stay motivated through this process when it comes like month 2, month 3? Do you have tips that you give your patients to kind of stay on track, as it were?
It's a really great question, because this was kind of a central theme, for me when I was seeing patients, is how do you keep people motivated to continue? Now, part of it is people start to improve, and so there's that own motivation. But, when I was seeing patients, it was really helpful. I would have them come in once a month just to have somebody who holds you accountable. And that accountability and just feeling like you're part of a group is so powerful for maintaining success in a program like this. So we actually created a program called the Prime Club, and the website is just simply theprimeclub.com. And it was created for this very specific purpose. And so I've trained several coaches who've actually gone through the program, and they help people to go through the process together in groups. And we have live video conference calls as groups, monthly webinars where I'm answering questions, as well as a series of 9 videos, as well as 9 lessons, so that people have all this added support as they're going through the program. And that has been kind of the most powerful tool to keep people engaged as they're going through the process, and also just to share their stories and, really shed their old story of themselves and start to script new stories with the loving support of the groups.
I love that. I love finding new ways to kind of get community together, especially the strange paradox that, we seem more connected because of technology, but we are in so many ways more disconnected than we've ever been. So that's awesome. So where can people find out more about you, the work that you do? What's the best way to get your book if people are interested?
The book is available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, on most of the websites that are linked to bookstores, but Amazon tends to be, I think, the most popular. And my personal website is just drkulreetchaudhary.com. That's DR, and then my first and last name.com. And we have, as I mentioned, a very, very vibrant community through the Prime Club. And that's usually kind of the easiest way to connect with me. We post all of my most recent blogs on that website, and that's just theprimeclub.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today, Dr. Kulreet. I think there was a lot of really amazing info here, packed just like your book is packed with a lot of really great info. I obviously been going over and reading it. It's one of those things I'm gonna have to reread and kind of come back to often, because there is so much information in there. But I really appreciate that, because I'm very detail oriented. So I want to know about all these biochemical things that are happening in the body, which you do get into, but you also offer very clear and simple instructions for people, which I think is helpful. So I'm excited to get more into that. And thank you so much for being on the show today. We really appreciate everything, and hopefully people will check out the Prime Club and your book. And thanks again for being on the show.
It was my pleasure, Ashton. Thanks so much for having me on.
Awesome. And for all of our listeners out there, thank you so much for listening. I am certain that you've learned a lot, and I hope you can incorporate some of these things to improve your health and your day-to-day life. Thank you for listening. Namaste. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to the show today. Please go over to iTunes, write a review, let us know what you think. It helps us in creating new content for all of you. It also helps new listeners get a sense of what to expect from the show. We really appreciate your feedback. Thanks again for listening. Namaste.
You've been listening to the Savannah Podcast. To find out more about Savannah, go to savannahspirit.com or follow Savannah on Facebook at facebook.com/Savannah Spirit. For daily inspiration, check out our blog at savannaheast.com. Be sure to join us next week for a new episode, and thank you for listening to the Savannah Podcast.